Hello, my name is Simon. Welcome to Why Is That, a free speech platform where we explore big ideas and the controversies of our time. Hello, beloveds, and welcome back to another episode of Why Is That, exploring big ideas and the controversies of our time. We are in our second part of our interview with Karen Straughan, who is one of the world's most popular men's rights activists, talking about men's issues today.
And I seem to recall in the first episode you called me the most popular men's rights activist.
But you got less popular in that time.
I was going to call you on that. I'm probably not the most popular, but
we love you.
I'm glad you corrected yourself.
I think you've got a reasonable claim for it. I don't know who else you could put above that. You. Most people, at least I think you're the most popular who describes themselves as a men's rights advocate. I mean, most people don't like that label.
Most people try and stay away from it because it comes with all kinds of nasty invective and assumptions and stuff. I mean, oh my goodness, what rights do men need? Men already have too many rights.
Yeah.
I actually recall I was handing out literature on domestic violence at a Walk a Mile in Her Shoes event in my hometown of Edmonton, Canada. And I was there with a gentleman from Men's Rights Edmonton, and he was wearing his famous sandwich board that said Men's Rights Edmonton, and also handing out literature. And a woman came up to us in a organizer's or staff shirt for the event, and she said, "Men's rights, men already have too many rights." And he kind of leans forward and holds out his handful of pamphlets and says, "Actually," and he's about to explain rights that women have that men don't, and she grabbed all of them out of his hand and she yelled, "Give me those!" And she just took off. And he and I were both standing there going, what just happened?
Yeah.
That was very strange.
I mean, that's not... imagine that sort of reversed with the male men's rights activist replaced with a female feminist with her pamphlets.
Oh, there's just no way.
The police would be called.
I don't think that you can find any incident of men's rights activists disrupting any feminist event anywhere. Men's rights activists and anti-feminists and people like that will, swarm the comment sections of certain videos on YouTube that are put out by feminists that are completely ridiculous, and they will... But there's a difference between leaving a nasty comment, even if it's a really, really just a nasty drive-by insult, under a video that's already put up that anybody can view uninterrupted, and not even look at the comments. There's a massive difference between that and actually picketing an event or kicking somebody out of a venue or shutting down an event or disrupting an event with noisemakers and all kinds of yelling and screaming and stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's completely different.
I've seen online an enormous amount of men's rights examples of men's rights conferences, etc., with feminists pulling the fire alarm on one of them and calling it a bomb threat to another one.
Oh, there was a protest at the Warren Farrell talk in 2012.
Oh, that one as well.
Well, Warren Farrell in 2012, that, I think, I don't know whether the fire alarm was pulled, but they barricaded the doors, and the police had to remove them, and so they were essentially committing criminal assault on the attendees who were trying to get in. And then when the police tried to remove them, they committed criminal assault on the police. And there were no arrests made or anything like that. The entire protest was endorsed by the Women's Studies Department of that university and also by the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which is our largest public sector union in Canada. It pretty much represents every government employee out there. So you essentially had the establishment protesting this really obscure event that maybe might have had 100 attendees, if that, and causing, you know, all of this grief and delaying it. It delayed it for an hour and a half or something like that by the time they were able to get underway. And there have been other incidents of massive disruptions, fire alarms being pulled. In one talk, Catherine Young and Paul Nathanson were giving a talk at the University of Toronto, I believe, and the fire alarm was pulled, and then the protesters held the emergency doors shut.
That's an interesting combo.
That people couldn't get out.
Just talking about the violent aspect of this, well perceived, because I've heard a lot of stories from men about domestic abuse they have suffered at the hands of their wives, but due to the Duluth model, the law doesn't recognise it. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. It's like, here's the thing, right? We have this impression that it was feminists who came along in the 1960s and told us all that beating your wife is wrong. But if you actually take even a cursory glance at the history, you can find Theodore Roosevelt in his 1906 State of the Union address saying that he wanted to bring back the whipping post for men who beat their wives, because that used to be the punishment before the whipping post was banned. And the reason it was the preferred punishment was because if you fined a man, the money came out of the family purse, and so his wife suffered along with him. And if you jailed him, he couldn't work and earn income, and so his wife suffered along with him. But if he took 30 lashes at the public post, he could still perform his duties as a husband, and she would not have to suffer with him, and she would not be punished alongside him. Then you go back to Blackstone, and there were provisions in the laws of England and Wales, common law, ensuring that women had the security of the peace against their husbands, and that it was illegal to use violence or restraint against them, and all of that stuff, right? So there has very, very rarely been gender-neutral domestic violence law in history. I think Massachusetts in the 1600s had a gender-neutral domestic violence law that essentially said no spouse shall strike the other, and if they do, it's a crime. So essentially what you have is this one-sided view that we've always had, and feminists came along in the 1970s, took over the domestic violence shelter movement that was started by a visionary named Erin Pitsey in the UK. She opened the first domestic violence shelter in the world in Chiswick, England. And she found that 60% of her, the women who sought refuge at her shelter were as violent as or more violent than the men they were fleeing. And she tried to open a shelter for men. The city council gave her a house that she could use, but she could not find any private donors who were willing to donate the funds to operate it. The whole thing fell through. Eventually, the feminist movement took over. They did a hostile takeover of her shelter movement. She continued to speak out, but she was driven from the UK to live in hiding with American relatives in the U.S. When the police finally told her to have all of her mail redirected to the bomb unit so that it could be checked before she opened it, she was living under such a burden of death threats and threats of violence and arson and bomb threats and things like that. She was picketed pretty much everywhere she went. Mm-hmm. So feminists kind of took the whole thing over, the whole issue over, and they turned it into this sort of patriarchal construct where the entire thing was based on men and women's relative political positions in society. And so it's a microcosmic reflection of patriarchy. And so because it's all based on male dominance and female subordination. Men are the ones who commit domestic abuse. They do it in order to keep their wives subordinated and maintain their dominance. Whereas if women ever actually hit their husbands, they're either only doing it in self-defense, or they're doing it in preemptive self-defense, or they're doing it, in the words of one feminist researcher, violent resistance. So they are striking up at an oppressor rather than striking down at a subordinate. So they've framed the entire issue in terms of this weird power dynamic that doesn't necessarily play out in terms of people's interpersonal relationships. I'm sure we all are aware of some relationships where the woman is the more domineering partner and the man is the more submissive partner. I'm sure that we know of many relationships that are fairly egalitarian. I'm sure we know of many relationships where the roles of who's in charge and who's the leader and who's the follower shift depending on the circumstance. Mm. And none of their paradigm takes any of that into account. So what we have is a body of laws and policies that are based on this single view of domestic violence that is based on the patriarchal oppression of women, when in reality, when you actually look at the statistics, that's the most rare form of violence that there is. You know, we have movies like Enough and like Sleeping with the Enemy and, you know, all of these Lifetime made-for-TV movies and stuff like that that depict this, you know, the horrible, angry, hateful, abusive, misogynistic man who beats his wife for, you know, burning the toast or, you know, spilling a little bit of coffee or something like that. That's extremely rare. And it's actually only half as common as a woman who treats her husband that way, right? Women can be, there's like a viciousness to women that people, some women, that people just do not want to see. And then on top of that, the vast majority of cases of domestic violence are what has been called in the literature common couple violence. It's sporadic incidents brought on by external stressors, like, I don't know, maybe you're having to declare bankruptcy or something, or you're going to lose your car's being repoed, or your kid is going through, you know, maybe he's addicted to meth or something like that, and you have to deal with that. Or your daughter turned up pregnant or something, and you have this massive, huge stress that's pressing in on you, and you argue, and you have conflict, and you fight, and sometimes you might push or slap or something. And generally those cases are trivial incidents. They're minor. They don't result in injury. They de-escalate over time, and they need to be looked at in terms of not blaming either partner, because they're not. I don't think that they are cases of abuse. I think that they're cases of people just losing control in a heated moment. There's a difference between somebody who loses their minds under a huge amount of stress and lashes out. There's a difference between that and a pattern of abuse that occurs over years and that grinds somebody into the dirt and sort of teaches them to see themselves as less than human, right? Yet we treat all cases as if they are that second thing that I said, and we only treat them like that if we can pin the violence on the man. And it doesn't matter how often or how frequently or how much a woman was hitting the man. If he retaliates in any way, he is a patriarchal oppressor asserting his dominance and control over his woman.
Well, and if I was to play a bit of devil's advocate there, though, most men are stronger than most women physically. Isn't it somewhat reasonable to have a different standard for women hitting men than we do for men hitting women based on that?
You know, I would say, well, I would not say so, but then I would have a standard where a slap or a shove or something like that would not be treated as a criminal act. I wouldn't treat it like that, just like I wouldn't report my 12-year-old for assault to the police for hitting his younger brother, when his younger brother was really, really provoking. Most assaults happen, they get dealt with between the parties, and they just are dealt with that way, and people learn a lesson maybe, but they aren't generally dealt with it as a criminal offense. So I would essentially say that there shouldn't be a double standard, because I wouldn't necessarily want a man who slapped his wife in the heat of the moment once, over a 15-year marriage, to go to jail any more than I would want a woman who slapped her husband once in a 15-year marriage in the heat of the moment over some really big deal, to go to jail. I don't think that's the answer for couples like that go through those kinds of things.
I also think that most men, I think, at least around half of them, I think about probably most men, have been struck at some point in their relationship by their female partner. It's usually not seen as a particularly big deal.
Yeah, most men have been hit by a partner. In fact, I think in terms of interpersonal violence, so violence by a family member, violence by a parent or by a caregiver or by a sibling or by a spouse or girlfriend or whatever, I think the number for men is probably 1 in 1. 1 in 1 men have experienced some form of interpersonal violence on the receiving end, and I don't think that those numbers are the same for women. I think that even if you look at how often parents hit their children, they hit their boys 2 to 3 times as often as they hit their girls, and that starts before age 1. It essentially starts when babies start to crawl and they stop staying where you put them, and that's when parents start hitting. So, we really have to look at it in terms of what's reasonable. And is it reasonable to criminalize every single instance of a partner assaulting the other partner? I don't think so. I particularly don't think so because, I myself have assaulted my partner. He said something really egregious. I don't even remember what it was. And I slapped him across the face. And about 1/10 of a second later, he slapped me back about as hard. And I knew he was going to do it before I hit him. And so I wasn't shocked. I wasn't surprised. And then I sat there and I thought about it. And I thought, is it worth getting hit again to hit him again? And it was actually a decision that played out in my mind. Because I know if I hit him again, he's going to hit me back. And it would feel real good to hit him again.
But you don't want to get hit.
Yeah, well, and then we talked about it, and I told him what I was thinking, and he said, yeah, I know, I could see your gears going.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is...
This is like 5 years ago, and it's never happened since. And it's just like, do I need to go to prison for instigating that? Does he need to go to prison for retaliating?
Well, I think if someone had called the cops for that scenario, I don't think it's pretty...
he'd have been the one to go to jail.
Yeah.
And the problem is, in so many cases now, is you actually have women who could actually use some help, or families who could actually use some help from the police or from some kind of social services. They will not call now. These women will not call because they don't want their husband to go to jail. Just like I would not have wanted my boyfriend to go to jail for hitting me back. These women do not want their husband to go to jail. They just need some help sorting out their stuff, right? Sorting out their emotions and their conflicts and stuff like that. If they actually call anybody for help, it's going to be reported to the police, and then the wheels get set in motion, and she can't call it off. There are mandatory arrest policies, no-drop policies, predominant aggressor policies, all that are aimed at not just putting him in jail, but in terminating the relationship. Essentially, if you want help from a domestic violence service in the U.S. that's funded by the Violence Against Women Act, they are not allowed to recommend couples counseling. They're not allowed to recommend that. Here, go to a counselor and sort out your conflicts. Yeah, no, they're not allowed to do that. Their course of action is to break up the family. That's what they are there to do. Because under the paradigm that feminists have set out, if he hits you once, it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, guaranteed, until he kills you. This is not the way it plays out in the real world. In a tiny, tiny minority of cases, this is what happens. But in the vast majority of cases, it's not.
Karen, I've noticed, there's a big push from feminism about, there's all this misogyny in society, institutionalized sexism, the irrational hatred of men against women. As we've said in previous shows, men love women.
Yeah.
We spend all this time trying to impress them and make them happy, etc. How do you think they sort of get away with saying, all these men who secretly hate women out there?
I think it's because there is no man on earth who thinks that women could be loved enough. And because women are not loved enough, because women suffer any difficulty whatsoever, because women have any sort of adversity that they might face, any kind of suffering at all, right? That is indicative of a systemic societal misogyny. If any woman, it was at the UN. At the UN's UN Women's Broadband Commission on Cyber Violence Against Women and Girls, one of the speakers there said that violence against women is still an epidemic. It happens in every single country in the world. Well, so does violence against men at 3 to 4 times the rate, and that's just in terms of crime. When it comes to state violence that is not necessarily categorized as a crime, war violence that is not necessarily categorized as a crime, you're going to see much higher numbers of male victims of actual violence. And so you essentially have this woman essentially saying that as long as there is a country, as long as there's one woman in every country in the world who's ever been slapped by anybody, right, violence against women is globally epidemic.
Yeah. The sort of the violence against women as a specific cause to fight against has always seemed a little bit odd to me. If you're going to carve out a specific portion of violence, that's not always the best approach, but if you are going to do it, presumably you'd go over the one that is more common, the one that actually seems to be a more regular occurrence, but they go for the one that is less common and say that's the real problem, which is a little bit strange.
I would disagree. With that. I don't think that necessarily how common something is the primary reason why we should target a problem. I think that the vulnerability of the victims, right? Because when you have a woman who's in a relationship and she's being hit by her partner, or you have a man who's in a relationship and he's being hit by his partner, these are adults, and they have checking accounts, and they have driver's licenses, and they have, they usually have jobs, and they have networks of people that they can ask for help, whether those are personal networks or governmental networks. They have the wherewithal to get up and walk away from that if it gets bad enough. And many of them choose not to, and many of them end up, sort of with that sort of Stockholm Syndrome issue where they just feel like they can't leave even though they can. But the reality is that they can. They can leave. Even if they don't feel like they can, they absolutely can. And adults have an ability to protect themselves, to take preventative measures in terms of street violence and things like that. It doesn't always work, but at least they have the ability to reduce their risk and the wherewithal and maturity to do that. I would say that the biggest violence problem that we have is violence against children. That's the one that we should be targeting. And unfortunately, violence against women has completely eclipsed that. It is it is our smallest violence problem, and it gets the absolute most attention, to the point where it's starving attention from even violence against children, where violent mothers are allowed to maintain custody of their children and then drown them in bathtubs and horrible things like that, because, you know, she had her reasons for, you know, abusing her kids or whatever, or it would hurt her to take them away, or who knows what the reasoning is in some of these decisions. Or her husband was obviously abusive, because only an abusive man would be trying to take her children away from her. So you essentially have the most vulnerable group in society, which is children of both sexes, who are, they're considered second to women in terms of violence prevention measures and programs and stuff like that. And I think that's just sad.
Yeah. Hey, well, we're coming up to only a few minutes left to go, but I wanted to ask, so if the listener has at this point been going along with everything, and they are in agreement, and they do think that there is some kind of an empathy gap towards men, which is seeing some tangible results, what could they actually do to work against that?
I think, you know, the biggest step that you can make is one that's at a personal level, and that's sort of, and it's not necessarily, you know, opening your heart to the men in your life and you know, saying, you know, be vulnerable around me and stuff like that, but just try to understand the men in your life and why they are the way they are. They have a good reason for being that way. I would suggest preparing your sons for the world that they will be growing into as adults. Don't shelter them from it. Let them know. Let them know. My parents let me know that life isn't always fair from the time that I was very young, and it didn't crush my little spirit. Letting your boys know that life isn't going to be fair to you in this way, that way, and the other way, and so you need to just be careful, right? That's no different than warning them to be careful driving home, or not hitchhike, or whatever. It's just letting them know what the world that they're growing into is going to be like for them, and preparing them.
Karen, we've got 1 minute left. Could you please tell us where to find you if people want to know more?
Oh, yeah, you can just Google Girl Writes What, or you can Google my name. I will be the first million hits if you just Google my name, because it's not a very common name. So, yeah, and I can be found on YouTube and other horrible places like that.
Don't forget Honey Badger Radio.
Of iniquity.
Don't forget Honey Badger Radio.
Honey Badger Radio, of course. We have a whole team there, and I'm just a small part of it. But, yeah, anybody who wants to learn more about the issues, particularly about the empathy gap, I would suggest listening to Honey Badger Radio, and particularly the work of Alison Tiemann, who is our CEO, if you will. And she's got a lot of really good work on all of that stuff. So,
well, thank you very much, Karen, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Join me, Simon and guests, 104.6 FM at 3:15 on Tuesdays for my show, Why Is That? Or anytime online at planetaudio.org.au.